Hello, everyone. Good evening, good afternoon, good morning, depending on whichever part of the globe you are now. I have great pleasure in welcoming you all to yet another session of the State of the Art in Neonatology. Thank you so much for joining us today. Today we learn from the legends jointly with Neonatal Expert Talk series, next series by National Neonatology Forum India. So before we move on, may I request Professor Praveen Kumar, President, National Neonatology Forum India, to speak a few words and inaugurate our series and NNF next. Over to you.
Thank you, Manoj. Thank you so much. And a very warm welcome to all the people who have joined the session today. And on behalf of National Neonatology Forum, it gives me a great pleasure to start this new series, which is basically inspired by the Learn from Legends, which have been going on. As you know, NNF have been conducting several offline programs and then converting to online programs during the COVID pandemic. And right now, we are all in the hybrid mode, which means we have several offline programs and online programs. And the programs are catering to diverse group of people, starting from the very basics to level 2 newborn care to very advanced newborn care. So this series of expert talks is directed towards basically the advanced level. And our focus is basically to highlight or bring the experts to you who have done original work in some particular field related to newborn health, whether they are stationed in India or abroad. And we would certainly like to kind of, bring forward, especially the people of Indian origin. Of course, it's not restricted. And I'm very thankful to Professor Anup Katheria to join us for this inaugural session of 2023. And we all have been reading about his articles, etc. And I'm sure the team is going to introduce him in much more detail. So I would simply like to thank Professor Manoj and the whole next team members, Dr. Sanjay Wazir, Dr. Somashri Ray, Dr. Vishnu Mohan, Dr. Rajendra Prasad, Dr. Giridhar, Dr. Prakash, who have been working in the background for last couple of months to bring this to, and they have a very well organized and planned program for next at least 3 months right now. And I'm sure more will be forthcoming. So without wasting much time, I would simply hand over back to Dr. Manoj to start the scientific program for the today. Over to you, Manoj.
Thank you so much, sir. It is indeed an honor for National Neonatology Forum to have a great academician like you to lead the forum. Friends, I have great pleasure to introduce the moderators for today. Dr. Sanjay Wazir, a good friend of mine and a senior consultant neonatologist from Gurugram, Haryana, near New Delhi, India. And Dr. Somashri Ray, another good friend of mine and assistant professor of neonatology from Government Medical College, Kolkata, India. Hearty welcome, Sanjay and Somashri. Now it's my thank you. Now it's my honor and privilege to introduce and welcome the legend of the day, Professor Anup Katheria. Well, Dr. Katheria is the director of Neonatal Research Institute and NICU follow-up clinic at Sharp Mary Birch Hospital for Women and Newborn. He earned his BS in biology from University of California, Los Angeles, his MD from Drexel University College of Medicine, completed his pediatric residency at Children's Hospital of Orange County, and his neonatal perinatal fellowship at the University of California, San Diego. Friends, we all know he's a great researcher and a genuine human being. I do not want to waste time reading his long biodata. Let me just tell you a few things about him. He's the principal investigator for several trials. To mention a few, comparing cord milking to early cord clamping in term non-vigorous infants, the MINV trial, comparing delayed cord clamping to umbilical cord milking to preterm infants, PRIMO2 trial, wow. Comparing early CPAP to early caffeine plus LISA, CALI trial in preterm infants, and comparing high versus low oxygen during delayed cord clamping in extreme preterm infants, the DOXY trial. Long back, I remember when we had registered a study on milking of preterm infants, and when we enrolled babies and when we started, we got a prompt mail from him saying that to all the principal investigators who had registered, stop milking below 28 weeks because we have received, we have enough evidence to say that it causes harm, average, and all that. So is the dedication that he makes sure that everything goes on very well. So friends, who else can be better than this great academician to tell us today about what's new in umbilical cord management? Hearty welcome, Anup.
Thank you so much, Dr. Manoj. And again, I'm really honored to be here and be able to present to you virtually, and hopefully one day be able to come to India. It's been a long time for me and my family. So
we would really love that. We would really love to have you with us in person.
Thank
Friends,
you. Okay.
Without wasting any more time, let's hear from the horse's mouth whether we should do early or delayed or physiologic clamping, or should we milk? Over to you, sir.
All right, let me share my screen. And you tell me, Manoj, can you see this perfectly? Is this good?
This is good. To me,
All
it's good. Sanjay, how is it?
It works
Yeah.
fine.
Okay.
Please go ahead.
All right, I will start. So I do have a lot of content, and what I really wanted to do was give as much of an overview of various concepts in cord management. So hopefully I can get through all this content in time, but I want to also hear from you and your questions. So I have no financial conflicts, but most of the work I'm presenting is from our federal funded grants, as well as the Thrasher Research Foundation. So, my talk is not to talk about why delayed cord clamping is good for babies. I think everybody in this audience knows that delayed cord clamping helps babies. It's beneficial. And if you needed any landmark studies to show the benefits, there's some of them here showing that there are benefits in long-term neurological outcomes, reduced hospital mortality in preterms, and better volume, blood, iron stores, reducing anemia, which we know is so important in many of our infants. So this talk is more of some of the nuances and subtleties of providing additional blood to these infants. And so the concerns, though, around delayed cord clamping are many. And this slide is just an overview of some of the things that providers have concerns when they do delayed cord clamping, such as placental insufficiency, multiple gestations if there's twin-to-twin transfusion, polycythemia, jaundice. But the biggest one most providers have concerns about are delaying resuscitation. If the baby's not breathing or is limp, what do we do in those situations when we have to resuscitate the baby? And that's been mostly where my research focus has been and the areas of work, but I'm happy to sort of discuss these other aspects as well. Now, it's important to understand the mechanisms of placental transfusion. And so I've obviously had some really great artists working with me. Many of you probably know Satyan Lakshrima, who's in UC Davis, has drawn some of these as well, and Dr. Jenny Koo. But this is a great overview of how blood moves from the placenta towards the infant. And you need these factors for it to work efficiently. So in the top left, when you have a uterus that's intact and squeezing on the placenta, that's going to drive blood from the placenta to the baby. On the bottom left here, you have the umbilical artery that over time, after the baby's born, will start to stop pulsation and therefore stop blood moving out of the baby towards the placenta, allowing a net flow of blood in towards the umbilical vein. On the top right here, you see that the baby needs to have breathing for this to occur. Negative intrathoracic pressure allows blood to move from the placenta through the ductus venosus into the right heart. And then lastly, you need an intrinsic cardiac activity. You need the heart to be pumping blood to move blood from the umbilical venous circulation to the pulmonary circulation. So if all these things happen and everything goes well, then now you get a nice pink baby and everybody's happy. And that's what happens in all of our healthy term babies. The problem is that when we have babies that need resuscitation, now the priority is from the obstetric team to give us, the neonatologist, this baby as soon as possible. And when we do that, we stop or we truncate that normal redistribution of blood that should move naturally from the placenta into the infant. And these factors now get modified. So now we go back to the original for looking at uterine contractions, for instance. If you cut through that uterus, whether it's a mom with labor or not, now the effect of it working properly in the placenta is diminished. And we know that our extremely preterm babies or urgent deliveries require cesarean sections. And I'll share data where this may not be working as effectively as vaginal birth. When we think about umbilical arteries in situations where we have a nuchal cord, it's not that the nuchal cord is compressing on the neck, it's that you're taking that thin-walled umbilical vein and that's being compressed while that thick-walled muscular artery stays open. So now you have blood essentially moving out of the baby towards the placenta through the artery while the vein is being collapsed. On the top right, we know that babies that have apnea or respiratory depression, or more importantly, extreme prematurity, where you have a high incidence of RDS where the lung is not going to inflate properly, they're not going to get the benefits of good spontaneous breathing, allowing placental blood to move in towards the baby. And then lastly, in really severe cases where the baby may have a low heart rate or even asystole, it's unclear whether or not any blood will move naturally towards that baby if the heart is not pumping effectively. So now you get a situation where the baby looks limp and not breathing, but and you get the baby faster, but you now have a baby with relative hypovolemia. And those babies become more difficult to resuscitate. And so I wanted to just for a minute here, stop and talk about this idea of placental transfusion, because unfortunately, it's still being debated by many people that, well, is this the major factor for delayed cord clamping? Is it the placenta transfusion or is it the hemodynamics? And I want to argue or convince you today that it's actually both, that the placental transfusion actually improves the hemodynamics in these babies. And in addition to all the benefits of blood, it's not just regular blood these babies are getting. This is hemoglobin F, which we'll talk about the benefits of fetal hemoglobin and the affinity for oxygen and oxygen delivery, but it also has stem cells and the ability to provide increased iron stores. So the blood itself is really important. It's not just to reduce blood transfusions, but many other factors. In addition, yes, if you wait to clamp the cord till later, you do get stable heart rates, improvements in SpO2 levels, et cetera. But it's important when I start talking about the comparison of the animal data to human data, these things might be a little bit different in terms of the physiology. And then lastly, I think it's a combination of both of these things together that then improve things like survival and long-term outcomes. But let's make sure we understand that blood is moving from the placenta to these babies, and that isn't a primary benefit of delayed cord clamping, or as we'll talk about later, cord milking. The reason I wanted to highlight this is that when we look at the animal models, and they're great at studying physiology and long aeration and transition, the sheep placenta is nothing like the human placenta. In fact, the sheep placenta is made up of little tiny placentas or cotyledons that then merge together with fetal vessels into one single umbilical cord that then has two veins, two arteries, and there's no sort of cushioning around it. There's no Wharton's jelly around the umbilical cord. And in fact, when the lamb delivers, typically the cord just snaps because there's no blood left inside the umbilical cord. There's no net placental transfusion that occurs naturally in the lamb. And so we need to think about this when we try to mimic some of the things we think might be happening in a human. They would be very different than lambs. And so the idea that blood is transferring from the placenta to the baby has been well documented. This is a great slide from Judith Mercer, but it's really from some of the very nice original data by Alice Yao, looking at the fact that as you do delayed cord clamping, you actually increase blood volume and improve this sort of change compared to baseline of over 30% by just waiting 3 minutes before clamping and cutting the cord. So this is an important aspect of understanding how waiting to clamp the cord and providing placental transfusion is occurring in human infants. The other piece that I alluded to earlier is the fact that this is not just like giving a regular blood transfusion. This is blood that has a high affinity for oxygen. And so when we think about fetal hemoglobin, and we know from our equations that this is going to be the primary deliverer of oxygen into the tissues, increasing the hemoglobin from 8 to 11 to 14, you can see that the oxygen delivery at the same saturation is going to be increased tremendously by 2 or 3-fold by increasing the hemoglobin in these babies prior to anything else happening. Now, we also have other studies suggesting that, in fact, the higher the hemoglobin F in babies, the lower likelihood of morbidities. This is just one study from several years ago demonstrating that babies that had a higher hemoglobin F had a lower incidence of BPD and a higher incidence of survival. So I think the first thing we can do in our newborns is to improve fetal hemoglobin before any of these other interventions occur. Now, let's talk about some of the nuances of delayed cord clamping and some of the debate that's happened. So gravity has been a big debated issue, whether or not holding the baby lower makes a difference. And so one very nice trial that was done by Nestor Vane in Argentina looked at holding the baby above or below the level of the introitus, and it was designed as a non-inferiority trial. And you can see here that the weight gain between both groups was similar, 53 and 56, pretty wide standard deviations, and they showed no difference at vaginal birth. And so one of the arguments is, well, fine, maybe at vaginal delivery, we can put the baby above on the mom's abdomen because that uterus is contracted. There's still going to be blood moving in towards the infant. So there was an animal study done, which was at cesarean section, which actually showed that whether you hold the lamb above or below the level of the uterine incision, that there was also no net difference. But again, this was an animal study where placental transfusion doesn't necessarily occur. And so it's not that both modes of delivery may be the same, they may in fact have a difference. And if you look at the role of uterine contractions, that if you have them present, in fact, that enhances the benefits of placental transfusion. This is an old study again by Yao showing that in the presence of strong uterine contractions, you do see a net transfusion independent of respirations. But during cesarean section, you need at least 10 seconds of breathing. So if you're going to have a C-section, you need other factors to be able to augment the benefit of a placental transfusion. So contractions may play a role in humans, but it's unclear sort of how that actually provides additional blood. Now, there were studies done again in animals demonstrating that giving oxytocin causes fluctuations and may not necessarily be beneficial in animal models. When you give, each time oxytocin was given, they saw these surges in blood flow. But again, in a human trial, there was no difference in placental transfusion when oxytocin was given during delayed cord clamping. Again, it may not be exactly the same when you're looking at oxytocin and contractions, but it may play a role if the mom is undergoing labor or not. So when we think about cesarean sections and mode of delivery, what studies have been done in human infants to show that a placental transfusion may be affected? And so this is a nice schematic, again, looking at some of the original work by Alice Yao and John Lin. So here in red are the vaginal deliveries. And you can see by the size of the circle, that's how much blood flow is going into the infant. And the longer you wait with delayed cord clamping and holding the infant about 10 centimeters below the level of the introitus, you can see at C-sections, you're getting this good amount of transfer. But in fact, at vaginal delivery, you're getting a good amount of transfer. But at C-section, if you hold the baby above the level of the introitus, you actually get lower blood cell transfer than you would if the baby was held lower. So there is something in terms of the amount of blood given to the baby. And these are old studies where we could actually do tagged biotin RBC studies to look at the amount of blood in the infant. That C-section makes a bigger difference in terms of where the baby's held, but it doesn't seem to make a big difference with vaginal delivery. So again, this is another argument that when you're having a cesarean section, you may need to keep the baby lower and not necessarily hold the baby as high. And then again, another study done by Alec Dandy. And what this is showing is that the C's are all the C-section babies. And here on the Y-axis is the amount of blood volume. And you can see the longer you go, with cesarean section, it didn't seem to increase blood volume as much. The circles are babies that actually got early cord clamping, but here the V's are the babies that had vaginal delivery, and the longer you waited, the more the blood volume increased. So this again highlights the mode of delivery issue that I think many of us have been concerned about. Can blood transfer occur during C-section? Absolutely. This is some nice data from Ola Anderson in Sweden, showing that even at 30 seconds of doing the cesarean section, you do get a slightly higher hemoglobin compared to early cord clamping, but not as good as the vaginal delivered delayed cord clamping for 3 minutes. So again, if you look at it, vaginal delivery is the best for transfer. If you're doing a C-section, you need other factors to help augment blood transfer in these infants. So again, looking at the translation of this data, placental transfusion does not occur in lambs. How relevant is this for humans? Well, we don't do these things in humans that we do in lambs, such as draining lung fluid, instrumenting them, and intubating them. But the studies help us to understand transitional physiology, such as the effects of lung aeration, et cetera. But remember, again, this is a schematic from one of the animal studies showing that the amount of blood flow going in through the umbilical artery and the umbilical vein was exactly the same. There's never any increased amount of blood flow happening in these lambs. So we need to then extrapolate what is the changes in hemodynamics when we compare the lambs into the humans. So the original lamb study that many of us thought about in terms of physiology was a study by Bott that took preterm lambs and said, let's clamp the cord right away without ventilating them for 2 minutes and look at the heart rates compared to ventilating the lambs the entire time for up to 2 to 3 minutes. And they show this dramatic drop in heart rate when you clamped early, but no change in heart rate when you ventilated the lambs. Now, what was interesting about this study is we assumed that heart rate was going to be the primary benefit, that bradycardia occurs when you clamp these cords early. Well, interestingly, a new study came out again in preterm lambs where they didn't wait as long to ventilate the lamb. So instead of waiting 2 minutes after clamping the cord to ventilate, they only waited 40 seconds. So they took lambs, clamped their cord for 40 seconds, and then ventilated them. And then in the intervention group, they ventilated them the entire time. And you can see there's no differences in heart rate. And the reason I'm pointing all this out is I'm going to show you some studies again in humans that get resuscitation. And you want to be able to look at this data and see whether or not it's different, because in fact, it might actually be the opposite. Here are some cardiac studies, just looking at physiology, what happens when you do delayed cord clamping and you do echo or ultrasounds or cardiac output monitoring. So there's a few studies on here. The first one has not been published yet, but was presented at European SPR by Gene Dempsey, showing that if you do delayed cord clamping you follow the left ventricular output, you can see it's increasing from during delay when the cord is clamped and 5 minutes after. So cardiac output continues to increase. This is a study we did in San Diego where we looked at delayed cord clamping with cardiac output monitoring. We put these little electrodes on the baby, and for every minute, we saw that the cardiac output from above baseline went up by about 13% all the way out to 5 minutes of life. And then this is a really nice study from Egypt showing that in the dotted line are the babies that received delayed cord clamping compared to immediate. And you can see that stroke volume and cardiac output continue to stay elevated with delayed cord clamping. So again, this is probably a factor of this additional blood volume that's being given to these babies. Now, in terms of breathing, this is a really nice study out of Europe that showed that the blood flow through the ductus venosus and hepatic veins, as the babies are having inspiration and expiration, it's mostly anterograde flow going towards the heart during breathing. And so most of the time that we see these babies having inhalation is probably contributing to this enhanced placental transfusion that we see. Now, when we take this and apply it to randomized controlled trials, so there's been 4 studies that have looked at neonatal resuscitation. So taking babies that aren't breathing well and then resuscitating them with the cord still intact. And then, we like to use these designations, low, middle income, high income. At the end of the day, there are just 4 different countries that have done these studies and looking at some of the physiological changes, which is what I wanted to compare with what I just shared with you in the animal trials. So the first one's actually out of Australia, which many of you might have seen this published last year by Bardudin. And this was looking at non-vigorous babies at around 32 weeks and above. So a little more preterm, but babies who were not breathing as well, comparing delayed cord clamping, or they called it physiological based cord clamping, where they waited till they saw CO2 detection on a colorimetric detector and then waited 60 seconds after, and comparing that to an early cord clamping group. And the outcome was looking at what the heart rate was. Again, basing that on the original animal data, trying to avoid that bradycardia that they saw in those preterm lambs. And what they found was that many of these babies did start to breathe fairly early. This is did lots of detailed recordings here. The babies in the ventilation group started to breathe by 57 seconds, and the babies in the early clamping group started to breathe by 48 seconds. So onset of breathing was not really delayed, but they did provide this additional respiratory support in the intervention group. But at the end of the day, the heart rates were identical. There was no difference in their heart rates at any time point. No difference in the amount of resuscitation received. And essentially, the trial showed similar outcomes between the two groups. Now, contrasting this study that was done in Australia with this study done in Nepal, so you could say maybe there's a little bit of demographic issues, high income versus low middle income country. This is a study by Casey Ashish and Ola Anderson looking at these non-vigorous babies born in Kathmandu. And what they found here is that the babies that had resuscitation with an intact cord actually had slightly higher APGARs, but the heart rates in the delayed cord clamping group were lower than the early cord clamping group. And you might say, well, how does that make sense? They actually had higher oxygen saturations as well. Why would they have a lower heart rate? And I'll show you this in other studies, but again, if you're giving babies this additional blood to the heart, you're actually going to possibly improve cardiac output and stroke volumes. Well, if you do that, your heart rate actually doesn't need to be as high and could actually be lower than an immediate cord clamping group that is hypovolemic and needs to then compensate with tachycardia, or at least relative tachycardia. So I think physiologically, we're seeing a little bit of a difference of effect in this trial. Now, there are two other trials. I'm not going to get into the whole detail of them, but I think you want to be able to compare them here. One of them was just recently published in the journal Pediatrics by Reina et al. That was done in India. And then we did a trial in San Diego about 3 years ago. And what you can see here is that between all of these trials, heart rate, at least in the majority of them, were lower with delayed cord clamping compared to immediate. And oxygen saturations were higher. Not in every trial, but I think we're seeing a consistent physiological signal that this additional blood is changing the hemodynamics of these babies who are non-vigorous at birth. Most of the trials had relatively similar onset of breathing, but I will highlight both the trial by Reina and Anderson, again, in Nepal and India, had probably a slightly sicker babies. The time of first breathing took a little bit longer than what we saw in the US and Australian studies. And the Reina studies, the first studies show any difference in a clinical outcome. They reduced NICU admission between the two groups. The APGARs I show you here were not different. They used something like an expanded APGAR score that was different. But I think most of us are looking for clinical outcomes that are different between the two groups. And all of these studies still have some limitations, such as excluding a lot of kids that were sick, that couldn't get it. If the whole point is doing resuscitation with an intact cord for sick babies, I will tell you from my own experience too, it's hard to get these babies into these research trials. And so we still need to do a better job of capturing the sickest infants that potentially can benefit the most from delayed cord clamping. Now, here's just a little example of a baby in one of our studies in the US, a preterm infant, because I wanted to talk a little bit about, did I lose my video? Oh no. Let's see. Oh, let me play it from here actually. There we go. Sorry about that. So this is just a preterm infant now getting resuscitation with an intact cord who's not asphyxiated, but is just getting this for augmenting of CPAP. And so I'll show you some of the studies now in this population. And this is just for a 1 minute delay. And then we give some breaths if the baby doesn't have CO2 detection change over here. Now, we thought this was going to be a very promising intervention, that if we gave all these babies CPAP and opened up their lungs, they'll get more placental transfusion and have better outcomes. And in fact, our trial showed no difference. We showed no difference in echoes, NIRS, all these other things. And literally every other study that's looked at for their primary outcome in preterm babies has not shown any difference in these major outcomes, which is really unfortunate, despite them having some pretty sizable babies in each of these groups. So we clearly need larger studies to be able to look at this. And fortunately, there are some really large studies that we should have some data, I think, later this year The Vent First study is still ongoing, but the ABC2 trial in Europe just finished. And the trial in Italy is still ongoing as well. So hopefully we'll have some idea of whether or not in preterm babies providing additional support improves outcomes. One of the reasons I think it hasn't improved outcomes is this slide here. This is from my study that did not show any difference in by providing CPAP versus stimulation alone. If you look at the red line, which are the babies who are ventilated, and the blue line, which was the babies who were just stimulated, you could see that the onset of breathing, because we did video recordings of these babies, there was no difference from birth all the way till the full minute. But what it showed is that babies take time to start to breathe. So even at 20 seconds, only about 40 to 50% of the babies are breathing. When you get to 40 seconds, it's around 70. And then by the time you get to a minute, it's 90. And so you could argue that, well, even if you don't give them CPAP, a lot of these babies might start to initiate some form of breathing. And in fact, Ola Anderson did a subgroup analysis where they looked at babies who were not in their trial, but they'd still got stimulation before the cord was clamped or stimulation and ventilation after the cord was clamped. And if you try to stimulate them to breathe while the cord was connected, they actually ended up needing less positive pressure ventilation and had a better 1 minute APGAR score than if you quickly clamp the cord and then tried to resuscitate them. And so babies do seem to respond better if you can provide some initial stimulation and get them to start to breathe even before you do anything else to them. And this also gets into the challenges of ventilation. Many people say, oh, it's not that hard to do intact cord resuscitation. And I know there are several centers in India that are doing this, and they have their own trolleys and setup, but it takes a lot of effort. You need to make sure you have room. This is a drawing of our operating room where you have 2 obstetricians, then you have the technician that's handling the tools, and then you have this little corner here where you can have somebody who's like a respiratory therapist in our country, but if it's a neonatal practitioner or somebody, they only have this one corner to provide all the support they need for that baby. And the same is true at vaginal birth. You might have a parent or support person, a nurse for the mother, and then sort of between the mom's legs, you have the OB, and then the bed between there, trying to get the whole team in to provide support. So this takes a lot of logistics, and we need to really make sure that this is better than just doing delayed cord clamping alone if we're going to implement this as routine practice. I do think for the parents, this has been a very positive thing. They really enjoy being able to touch and see their baby. If you look at the purple here being very important. As far as impeding care and the process of providing resuscitation, most people did not find it very concerning, but some of them found it slightly to moderate in terms of getting access to the baby or being able to provide monitoring as well. And this is some of the schematics between my country and how we do vaginal birth, and then say England, where these trolleys and some of these devices have been set up. And I'm pretty sure in India it varies as well. But I think at the end of the day, you need to have a setup where the bed can be next to the mother and you can have full access to those infants. And then the other practical considerations is when we looked at the LAM data, we thought this is what we were seeing, that the stable heart rate and cardiac outputs is in these white circles. If you ventilated, where it's going to happen right from birth. And in reality, it doesn't look like this cartoon by Satyan. In fact, it looks like this. This is the lamb that is intubated, anesthetized, and is getting every single breath being consistently delivered. And that's why you get this beautiful, smooth transition. But we know now that, in fact, babies are hard to resuscitate in the first few seconds. And even on the cord, you have issues with a closed glottis. This is looking at glottic closure over time. This is just in an animal model for spontaneously breathing rabbits, showing that about a quarter of the time the glottis was closed, and it takes almost till the full hour till it's consistently open. And we've all seen this when we tried to put an airway in a baby, or we're giving breaths and none of the air is going in. This is a challenge with babies, particularly when they're hypoxic or there's high levels of magnesium or other concerns in these infants. Putting just a mask on the face causes a reflex as well, where the glottis can close. And this is just an example of another trial where 50% of the babies stopped breathing when they looked at respiratory function monitoring when the mask was placed. So these are other issues for us to figure out. And then if we're going to do longer and longer delays, we have to look at the compliance, because if the compliance in research studies is bad, what is it going to be like in real life? Where you look at the original trials by Judith Mercer had 30-second delays. The Australian trial went to 60 seconds, the UK trial to 2 minutes. What is the adherence going to be at 3 minutes, 5 minutes, 10 minutes if we're doing longer and longer delays? Is it going to be less than 50%? Then it's not ideal for us to be doing these long delays if it's not going to be done consistently. And so when you look at the pros and cons of delayed cord clamping and resuscitation, there's lots of benefits in terms of the physiology and for the parents, but there are still a lot of concerns. We have to deal with short cords. Do we have good maternal safety data? If we're going to do long delays in the OR during cesarean section, all that blood is not the baby's blood, that's mother's blood. And so do we have good data that these mothers are not going to need blood transfusion or have other issues by having longer delays? Those are all things that we need to be able to think about. What about monitoring? You know, we've spent the last 30 years getting very good at heart rate monitoring, oxygen monitoring, titrating the amount of oxygen exposure. What do we do now if we're not going to monitor them in a sterile field? Are we going to create this sort of setup where we can do this properly? What about staff spacing? Is it just me by myself doing this, or can I still have extra help with the baby? But then if there's no room, what do I do? And then does every baby need a mask on their face? Or should we be doing early stimulation on some of these babies and see if they start breathing on their own rather than just jumping on every baby? It was one of the benefits of delayed clamping, just giving them some time. So I wanted to talk a little bit about the low oxygen issue too with delayed cord clamping. I think many of you probably have experienced where you have a baby getting delayed cord clamping that's preterm and they're crying, and then after 30 seconds, they sort of become apneic or stop breathing. Is there something that's happening to them over that first minute? This is a sub-study from our pre-mod 2 trial, and I'll talk about cord milking in a second, but the solid line here were babies that had cord milking, the dotted line was delayed cord clamping. And the reason I'm showing this red line here, this is the 80% saturation mark. And by 5 minutes of life, if you follow a line up here, you can see that about a third of the babies had a oxygen saturation below 80% in the delayed cord clamping group. That's the dotted line here. And why do these babies have lower oxygen saturation? Well, they're not getting any oxygen during delayed cord clamping, right? They're breathing ambient air. And is that a problem with our preterm infants? Well, one sort of study idea came from looking at 2 different oxygen levels. This is the study by Decker et al. In Leiden, where babies after the cord was clamped, they gave them either 100% or 30%. And I'll get to why I'm talking about these FiO2 levels. But what they showed is that if you start at 100% and wean down versus 30% and go up, the amount of oxygen exposure is the same, but they do get higher saturations in the first 5 minutes of life. But what was more fascinating for me was the way the babies breathed when you gave them 100% oxygen. They had better minute volume, better tidal volumes. You can even see, even though it wasn't significant, the respiratory rates looked a little bit higher and the average minute volume or the area under the curve was higher. The babies are breathing better with 100% oxygen, even for a short time. Could those benefits been then translated to delayed cord clamping if you did that while the babies were on the cord? And so we came up with like sort of a physiological model. And this is a nice drawing by Satya and saying, well, look, we all know that 100% oxygen after the cord is cut could be toxic, cause free radical damage. But if you give the 100% right when these babies are born, where their lungs are filled with fluid, there's mask leak, but now you could sort of overcome some of the glottic closure that I talked about earlier because they're not hypoxic, and you get the baby to start breathing, but then you deal with the high amounts of oxygen that may be going into the lungs by streaming in deoxygenated blood from the placenta. Remember, the placental PaO2 is quite low. And so now you're combining the two, and now does the rest of the body and the brain see systemic normoxia, where now you might be able to get the oxygen saturation better, but you don't get really high levels that cause sort of free radical damage and oxygen species that are going to be damaging the body later on, as we've seen in some of the older studies. So to sort of test this hypothesis, Satyan's group looked at lambs, and they gave the lambs either 100% oxygen for 5 minutes after the cord was cut, or they did delayed cord clamping, and they gave them 100% oxygen for just a minute and then did 30% afterwards. And you can see that here in the pink line, it's no different than if you're giving the baby 30% oxygen. The amount of PaO2 is similar. Now, when we looked at the oxygen saturations, again, if you do delayed cord clamping with 100% oxygen for a minute, and then 30% after, that seems like it follows this nice middle road where you're in the recommendation ranges for oxygen saturations, but you are lower if you start at 30% the entire time and not give them that initial 100% oxygen bump. And then clamping the cord right away gave them this really high oxygen saturation level. So we're doing a study. That's this study that Dr. Manoj is mentioning that we don't have any data yet because it's a trial that we're doing to compare 100% versus 30% oxygen during delayed cord clamping. See if these babies breathe better on the cord. Does it improve the oxygen saturation by 5 minutes of life? And then does that then translate to better outcomes, such as less IVH, et cetera, in a larger study? So that's probably more to come. Now, I wanted to spend a little bit of time on cord milking as well, but just the take-home points. If you're thinking about resuscitation with an intact cord, you want to do this in your NICU or your unit, remember that there is some physiological benefit, but we haven't seen, the only study so far to date is the REINA trial that showed a little bit of a reduction in NICU admission, but no studies in preterm babies have ever showed any benefit over delayed cord clamping alone yet. Now, there may be some data coming out in the next few years. If I was you and you've not done this yet, and you're trying to get better delayed cord clamping in your hospital, focus on stimulation. Try to get your obstetricians to gently, this is not, aggressively poking the baby, rub the baby's back, get the airway open and try to get them to breathe using gentle stimulation and Mr. SOPA techniques. And these babies might actually surprise you by breathing on their own. Remember, most preterm babies are not asphyxiated. They just have poor tone to start with. And I think once we start comparing which groups could benefit from oxygen, like we're looking at these extremely preterm babies, then we might be able to decide how should we be doing resuscitation with an intact cord. Okay, I think I have about 15 more minutes. I wanted to show you a little bit about milking. And I have this slide here to compare intact milking. As you can see up here, the obstetrician's milking the cord 3 times while the cord is still connected, comparing to this one, which is called cut cord milking. And this is a new term that I was trying to use in some of our review papers to illustrate the difference, because unfortunately, many of us have combined cord milking into one large bucket, which is, this is very different when you're milking the cord than this. In fact, this you only need to milk 1 time because you're only as you can see, this cord is completely empty of blood. There's no benefit of releasing it back into the cord and milking it again and again. So that's what cut cord milking is called. Now, cord milking has had obviously a very negative view because of many of these animal studies that have shown fluctuations with milking compared to delayed cord clamping. Again, remember, number 1 is that lambs do not get a placental transfusion. So what happens when you milk the cord into a lamb and you let go? The blood just comes right back. And in fact, they were trying to come up with this new method called milking with placental refill. Well, normally when you milk into a human, the blood continues to go into the baby. If you milk into a lamb, you have to force it in there by pinching one end and then milking the other end and keep pinching it in. In fact, this is just caused by you clamping and unclamping the cord. If you pinch and release the cord several times in a lamb, this is what you see. And so the argument of with milking causing harm is less about the blood flow going into the animal. It's more about the clamping and unclamping of the cord. And in fact, if you look at ventilating the lamb, and so these are 2 really nice studies, one done by Praveen in Buffalo and the other one by Doug Blank in Melbourne. They both show you that once you ventilate the lamb, the fluctuations go away. So the top panel here is when you started to milk the cord, and then as you're ventilating it, you don't see these fluctuations anymore. And the same thing over here on the left panel, this is without ventilation, and the right panel here is with ventilation. So there is something different about the animal model. When you aerate the lung, these changes become less apparent. And again, to argue that, in fact, milking is going to increase your hemoglobin. This is the latest Cochrane by Heike Reb in Europe, showing that all the studies that compare milking to early cord clamping all have improvements in hemoglobin. I think I think to this group, it's without question that you're going to get additional blood flow. The question is, what is milking doing that could be harmful in these babies? So originally for us, we saw improvements in blood flow with milking from hemodynamics. This is from my first trial. It's now almost 8 years old. The dotted line here showed is the milked group showing higher blood pressures, and then we showed higher flows in the heart, RVO and SVC flow, showing that babies are clearly getting additional blood with milking. The problem was when we did our multi-centered trial and looked at the small babies, we then found severe IVH in the babies that had cord milking compared to delayed cord clamping. Remember, the control group was delayed cord clamping. And so what happens as you milk the cord, so you're pushing on the umbilical vein and the artery, and you take subgroups like babies born by vaginal birth, so they're now getting uterine contractions, and that is forcing blood in even faster into this baby. Then as you milk the cord, the blood on the top end on the umbilical vein goes across the foramen ovale, increasing pressures on the left side of the heart. Meanwhile, on the left side of the heart, you're increasing blood pressure in the ascending aorta up to the descending aorta. And now you're going to have both of these sides of the heart increasing carotid artery blood flow. And you have to take some of these other confounders, chorioamnionitis, extreme prematurity that have really fragile germinal matrices. And these are the babies that are most likely to bleed. So a couple things, when we looked at vaginal delivery, chorioamnionitis, and the babies 23 to 27 weekers, those are the ones that had severe IVH. When you took chorio out, when you only looked at cesarean section, when you looked at older babies, we didn't see this. So there's definitely other factors that play into this, but to make things very clear, we were very worried about these tiny babies. And so we recommended not doing milking in them in the paper. And as Dr. Manoj said, we mentioned that to other investigators that are studying this. It's again, one trial, but it's in multiple centers. And so that was some of the concerns that we had with this group. Now, this doesn't mean milking is necessarily bad for all patients. In fact, milking is very good at transferring blood to the baby. This is the amount of blood left over in the placenta or placental residual blood volume. And you can see here that with immediate cord clamping, you have the most blood left over, right? So when we look at cord blood banking, clamping right away, you get a lot of blood. You wait 2 minutes, it drops. When you wait 5 minutes, it gets really low. Cord milking is somewhere in between a 2 and a 5 minute delay. And when we talk about the concerns of, well, how long can we wait on some of these babies? You can see where cord milking has a little bit of an advantage. It definitely has an advantage when it's compared to immediate cord clamping to provide this additional blood. And what people get really nervous about is, well, they say, Anup, we saw your data on severe IVH with milking, so now we're just going to clamp all these babies right away when they're not breathing under 27 weeks. And you have to think about, well, is there any data comparing milking to early cord clamping? Because we compared it to delayed cord clamping, which is the best method to use for these preterm babies. But is milking necessarily worse than early cord clamping? And the answer is no. In fact, if you look at this Cochrane just from a few years ago by Lene Seidler, you can see that most of the studies, if anything, were to the right of this forest plot. There was just 1 and 2 on the left here. But the majority of them show probably a slight benefit with intact cord milking, at least in the outcome of severe IVH. And so we need to think about, ideally, we need to find ways to avoid milking babies in general. But for these small babies, if we can try to compare that to immediate, don't think that immediate is necessarily avoiding any harm. You're probably just as likely or more likely to have an IVH in that group. Now, when we think about why milking could be safer in babies over 20 weeks, and I'm saying could be because we're still trying to finalize this question, is that at 28 weeks, you have lots of things that are benefiting you. You have a more mature germinal matrix that can handle this additional blood flow. You also have babies who are more likely to breathe better. They have a lower incidence of RDS. And so therefore, breathing is going to play a better role in terms of accepting that additional blood and not causing the harm. But it's in those older babies that can probably accept a rapid change in blood volume that might lead to less morbidity. Now, the reason I say might is we finished this study and we're hoping to present this at the PAS meeting in another month or two, but we looked at 1,000 plus babies above 28 weeks to make sure that milking is safe. Is it not only causing any differences in IVH, is it also going to cause any differences when we look at the babies at 2 years of age? Because we really need to make sure that there's no harm using milking in this extremely preterm group. Similarly, as we talked about at the beginning, we finished the study looking at near-term babies, 35 weeks and up, and looking at cord milking in non-vigorous babies, babies who you cannot do delayed cord clamping on because they're just too floppy and not breathing. And we know that term babies that are not breathing, they're not going to just start breathing on their own later. They need resuscitation. They could have HIE or other concerns. So we did a cluster crossover trial where we took every center, randomized them to either milking or early cord clamping. And then for 1 year, they either milked or clamped the cord early. And these babies at 35 to 42 weeks. And we excluded all the vigorous babies, all the babies that you would do delayed on, they were not part of the study. That was not the question we were interested in. And what we found are a number of our secondary outcomes were significant, but it's important to note that our primary outcome was not. It was looking at admission to the NICU. We thought that if you milk the cord, just like that the RENA study looked at delayed cord clamping, if you milked them, could you reduce admission to the NICU? And we showed that it did not make a difference when we adjusted by center. Overall, there was a reduction in admission to the NICU, but not by the cluster design. But we did show reductions in the amount of cardiorespiratory support. We showed higher hemoglobins, less moderate to severe HIE, less need for hypothermia, higher bilirubins as you would expect with milking, and a lower incidence of a very low APGAR score in the first minute of life. And yes, center variation did play into this. We found that high volume centers had the dramatic reduction in NICU admissions, but low volume centers, it did not seem to make as much of a difference. Unclear as to why, but there was a lot of variation by center. So even though overall the reduction was there in admission rate, by center, it was not. And we've done now 2 sub-studies looking at, from our main trial, we had some sub-centers that did like echo studies, and we just published those in the last few months. This one just came out in the journal Peds this month, and it showed that babies who had cord milking compared to early cord clamping had better SVC flow, left ventricular output, and right ventricular output, sort of what you'd expect if you're giving additional blood volume. You should have better hemodynamics. So that's sort of obvious. Another sub-study that we just published in Early Human Development last month was looking at babies with NIRS and their FiO2 and SpO2. The NIRS was not different between the 2 groups, but we showed that the babies who had cord milking required less FiO2 and actually had slightly higher saturations to start with, but overall were pretty similar. So milking can actually improve how much resuscitation you need and actually expose you to potentially less oxygen. Okay, I only have a few more minutes. I'm just going to kind of go through these last few fairly quickly. This is just to highlight, well, why would milking help the non-vigorous babies? You just told me it was harmful in the small babies. Well, non-vigorous term babies are going to have lower blood volume. If you look at this old data by Linderkamp, babies with low APGAR scores actually had less blood volume. If you took babies with nuchal cords, they were even worse. And so the hope is that right now with the current recommendations from ILCOR, which we all follow, we make our NRP guidelines, don't milk in the babies under 28 weeks, but does MINV help you for what to do in the babies above 34? And I hope maybe the recommendations may change over time. I just wanted to give a plug for our cord milk trial in India that I'm a co-PI with Zubair Gai. And these are some centers in India and Maharashtra and Nagpur and Pune that they're launching a very similar study to the MINV trial, looking at the reduction of HIE. So we hope to have some data in about 2 years for this trial as well. And then as far as cut cord milking, I just wanted to highlight that because it is a very different way of providing blood. You do provide some blood with it, but it might be less effective than intact cord milking. And so here are some studies that have looked at the comparison of the two. But there have been studies from India looking at, this is cut cord milking. The cord was cut and then it was milked several times into the infant. And this is a nice study by Upadhyay that showed higher ferritin levels. And these were in healthy term infants, but also a similar study in preterm infants that were non-vigorous by Ram Mohan that showed, in fact, these babies could also receive additional blood that were non-vigorous at birth as well. None of these studies have showed improvements in clinical outcomes, but it is reassuring to know that you can do cut cord milking as another option. But when you compare the two, this is a study out of Turkey looking at intact milking, cut cord milking, and immediate cord clamping. You do get better blood transfer if you look at things such as hemoglobin levels. with intact cord milking. So something to think about when you're looking at these different techniques. And then this is a trial that will probably be the largest trial on cord milking once it's finished on preterm babies. So this is going to be done in 3 groups: milking, intact cord, cut cord, and delayed cord clamping, to see whether or not there's a difference in severe IVH or death. And these are several centers in China that are shown here that are conducting that study. Okay, and then what about stem cells? Again, I highlighted that as another benefit. The reason I've always been interested in this topic is from this old study by Heike Ray, demonstrating that babies that had milking had prolonged, sustained higher hemoglobins in delayed cord clamping, and even less BPD in their initial pilot. Now, when you look at giving stem cells with milking compared to delayed cord clamping, one of the thoughts is that as you milk the cord, you release some of these mesenchymal stem cells that are in the lumen in Wharton's jelly. This is a cross section of an umbilical cord, and all the red dots are mesenchymal stem cells. And here is the vessel lumen and the umbilical vein showing the little nuclei of these mesenchymal stem cells. And so when we took the blood from milked babies and injected it into irradiated rats that did not have any bone marrow, bone marrow suppression, you could see that the milked rats stayed alive longer than the delayed cord clamping rats, showing that in fact you could repopulate the bone marrow and enhance hematopoiesis with cord milking compared to delayed cord clamping. And so there's a few studies that have already been done looking at CD34 counts in IUGR babies. And I don't have any data from them, but Atul Malhotra from Monash University is also doing lots of studies looking at giving cord blood with different techniques as well to reduce morbidity. So this is just a cartoon from Satyan. I'll skip through it, showing that in fact, as you milk the cord, you might get enhanced hematopoiesis. Okay, and this is just my conclusion slide. So I've been going really fast, but if there's any slide I would want to slow down on is, how do you take cord management together? This is not NRP. This is Anup Katheria's suggestion that we should really avoid early cord clamping as much as we can. If you have a bad nuchal cord or a cord avulsion, then you can clamp right away. But in general, I think we need to look at providing babies who are non-vigorous with delayed cord clamping, that with resuscitation if possible. Obviously, cord milking can be done in the term baby when you don't have the ability to do this. But my hope is we focus on delayed cord clamping as the priority, and then in some subgroups look at milking as a secondary option. I just wanted to thank my mentor, Neil Feiner, our research team, Satyan, who you all know very well, has done beautiful drawings, and Jenny Koo, my other artist, made us these great slides, as well as our families. And I am exactly at 8 o'clock my time, so I will stop there. Thank you for letting me go over.
Wow, that was truly amazing. Comprehensive coverage of all the aspects that we wanted to know.
Great.
Thank you so much, Prof Anup. Now, before we go on to panel discussion, we have Professor Francis Cowan, another senior neonatologist we look forward to. Madam, would you like to speak a few words, or shall we go on to discussion? You're muted, ma'am. Okay, I think there is some technical issue. So I would now invite our moderators for today, Dr. Sanjay Bazir and Dr. Somashri, to kindly take over. Thank you.
Thank you, Manoj, and thank you, Professor.
1 second, Sanjay, I think Madam as Professor Cowan has come live.
Okay, sure. I can go ahead.
Oh, sorry. Can you hear me now?
Yes, ma'am.
Please.
Yeah. Oh, I just said I'm only here to learn. I don't know much about this at all, and I'm interested to know whether the evidence is there at all that it helps to improve outcomes in term infants with HIE, and also if there's concerns about increased stroke after cord milking. So I'm just listening. Thank you for asking me.
Thank you, ma'am. Over to you, Sanjay.
Thank you, Manoj, and thank you, Professor Anup, for bringing all the aspects of cord clamping. In fact, I'm interesting quote that science begets more questions than answers, and like science is an exploration of more exploration and more discovery and new mysteries and areas for further investigations. And you've rightly kind of pointed out about all the new aspects where the cord clamping, despite being a recommendation for the last almost a decade, there are still controversies and still certain answers that people are seeking. And I'll take some of the questions, if you permit me, about from the audience. So I mean, Dr. Roy asks the question that how do you do DCC during cesarean section to maintain sterility? You showed the video and it was possible, but maybe there are concerns in not so good settings. So maybe your thoughts on how to maintain sterility.
Yeah, no, great. So a couple of things too. I do want to address Dr. Cohen's concern with milking and stroke. The cord milk study out of India will have MRIs done on those infants. Obviously, you can't see strokes on head ultrasound, but I think it's always the more robust safety data we can get anytime you're using a cord milking study, the better. Obviously, in our preterm babies, we did head ultrasounds, but that's not good enough. So I'm hoping that the India study will have good MR data demonstrating the safety. The argument again is if you're very hypovolemic, even giving sort of this rapid infusion of blood probably does more restoration than necessarily causing huge fluctuations that we saw in these anesthetized lambs. So don't have the answer, but hopefully we're getting it with those future trials coming up. Okay. And then regarding sterility, you're right. It's actually not 100% sterile to do delayed cord clamping with an intact cord in the operating room. What we do is that we're sterile going in, but unfortunately, no matter which companies we've spoken with about the mask and the tubing, they're not sterile. So once we put our hands on the baby's head with our sterile gloves, etc., we then are become clean but not sterile. We don't touch anything else above the sterile field. And we tell the obstetrician that anything sort of below the nipple line on the baby will remain sterile. So they can touch the baby, put the baby in little baggies like we do for our small babies, but don't touch anything near the baby's head. And that's how we sort of keep a line of pseudo sterility barrier. I will tell you, my operating room technicians are very nervous and very on top of me and making sure that I don't touch anything else. So we've not had any, we monitor for post-surgical infections as part of a safety measure for the trial. I know many other centers are doing that as well, but you technically cannot do currently today a resuscitation with an intact cord in a completely sterile circuit. So we've tried working with companies to do that, and it's still a challenge. So I urge you to try to keep your area that you're on a separate area that the baby's on that can be away from the obstetricians to do it properly. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, thank you. And Dr. Jennifer has a question that what are your thoughts on DCC in congenital heart disease? And maybe I put across to you other congenital anomalies like congenital heart disease and maybe pleural effusion, hydrops, and I know there's a trial going on congenital diaphragmatic hernia, but
right.
Like your thoughts on, and do you really want them to practice it in the real world scenarios? Because like outside of a trial scenario.
Well, I mean, I think again, for all those scenarios, it comes down to avoidance of early cord clamping. How much is the harmful compared to this theoretical concern of, okay, what happens if I do, say, for instance, delayed cord clamping in a congenital heart disease patient? We're actually starting a trial later this year with a hospital in Nationwide Children's in Ohio to look at 500 babies with the idea of you give delayed cord clamping at a critical congenital heart. So I'm not just talking about an isolated VSD, but severe tetralogies, transposition of the great vessels, babies who you think, oh my gosh, they need something right away. But what have you done? You've taken a baby in a fetal environment, moved them externally. They're still on the placenta. They're still getting oxygenation. What's changed? If you can provide those babies with this additional blood volume, now they go into surgery, they have an open chest, all these other morbidities, you probably are going to be able to help those babies even more. There was a pilot study in critical congenital heart disease by Carl Box that showed less blood transfusion, but I think the bigger question is, can you reduce other morbidities by giving those babies extra time on the cord. Same thing could be true for diaphragmatic hernias. The only group I think that some people have some question about whether to over transfuse is babies that already have high drops from being the recipient of a twin-to-twin. There you could argue those babies probably aren't going to benefit from a lot more blood. But I'll tell you, babies aren't going to necessarily take on a lot of additional blood volume unless they absolutely need it. So most of the times, even babies that are twin-to-twin, unless you're extremely concerned that they need urgent resuscitation, it's not necessarily going to cause any additional harm in those kids. And we've had kids, DIMO twins, et cetera, that received delayed cord clamping. Again, with the avoidance of clamping that cord right away before they're breathing, that's probably the most harmful thing that we could be doing for these babies than not. Same thing with IUGR babies with bad placentas. Why would you still do it? Well, let them aerate their lungs before you clamp and cut the cord. There's lots of still biological rationale, even though there hasn't been a specific trial for each of these nuanced things, that you should try your best to find a really strong reason not to clamp those cords right away in those babies.
So the next question, actually, you've answered most of it, but then, are there any real contraindications to doing a delayed cord clamping? Except for the twin.
Right, like the ones, the ones I said on the slide of babies you just physically, mechanically cannot. I used to get a lot of complaints. Well, we used to get these babies that were born at home and cold, and they have high crits and needed exchange transfusions. It's interesting, we don't see that anymore, right? We're not exchanging babies for high crits, and yet we're counting babies born in an environment that's not controlled, that might have lots of other factors, and they like to label and blame delayed cord clamping alone for it. And I'm sure there's many reasons why babies can have polycythemia or other problems. So again, the argument is most of these babies will benefit from that additional time on the cord, whether it's just breathing, giving them some more blood volume. I really don't see any true contraindications for babies. RH sensitization was one that's been disproved in another trial by Gavam. They've done babies on infants of diabetic mothers. So the people have tried to go through these things. They've tried to address hyperbilirubinemia with multiple meta-analyses, showing that you actually don't increase rates of phototherapy, even if the bilirubins are higher, which now we know is a really good antioxidant for babies. So, I think the longer we keep doing this, the more we'll find that we're really just trying to find excuses not to do it.
Absolutely. So one of the questions that you answered, but if you would really want to do it, what is the minimum time and what is the maximum time that you want people to suggest? And does it really need to be time-based or physiology-based?
I know, right. I was gonna say my physiological-based colleagues would not be happy with any time-based. And I'll say the reason why time is just helpful is that's how we think. When we're resuscitating a baby, we try to keep aware of things, APGARs, how long have I been giving positive pressure breath before ventilation? We're a time-based field. That's what neonatologists are. We think about things for resuscitation. So having something to at least aim for is great. And so if I'm going to say, well, I'm going to do physiological based cord clamping, I don't know what that means. If the baby's crying when the baby comes out, I'm still going to wait at least a minute to give it adequate blood to that baby. So I think if you're going to say, well, what's a minimum amount of time? I think a minute is a good place to start to get the baby. We know now most babies will start to breathe by a minute. We know that you do get a good amount of blood transfer in that first minute. But then I'd say, okay, once you're comfortable with that, start going longer to allow that baby to stabilize more, balancing the maternal risk factors with the baby's risk factors, and keeping in mind that those sicker babies probably need more time on the cord. And now I think that's where physiological based cord clamping makes sense. A really sick kid, you want to clamp and move quickly, but that's the kid that needs to stay on the cord longer and get more time to transition. So I don't know if that answered it completely. I don't know what an upper limit time is. I've never really thought of it that way, but I think that's a good starting point.
But at least a minute is something that you recommend, that as a starting point. Now, like you said, you would persuade all people to do it for a minute. A question is that how do you, counsel your obstetrical colleagues to do it? And how many people in a 50 kilometers or 100-mile area around your hospital do it because they're influenced by Professor Anup?
No, I don't have that much of an impact on the whole region, but I have an impact in my hospital. I will say that we have 70 obstetricians. We're the biggest delivery hospital in my state where I live. And what I've done is really taught the obstetricians about stimulation. If you have an obstetrician that knows now they need to start rubbing the baby's back, they cannot be holding the hemostat at the same time. So their anxiety to clamp the cord goes down because they are now helping you by letting that baby start to breathe. So they put the babies in these plastic wraps for temperature. They're the ones that hold the babies and rub their back. So then once the minute the timer goes off, then they can start thinking about, oh, okay, now the baby's at least a minute old. I can start clamping and cutting the cord. So we have a very high rate actually in our center for delayed cord clamping. Over 90% of all gestational age babies get delayed cord clamping. Only a few get milking, even though people think I only like to do milking. That's not true. We actually rather have every baby get delayed. But there are, of course, situations, and that might be a question, well, when do you milk? And those situations of bad abruptions or situations where you cannot wait, the very bad non-vigorous term kid, those are the kids we still routinely milk.
And if there is a new obstetrician joining your unit, so how do you counsel? That's the question that they're wanting to answer, because in India, they would probably be talking individually to each consultant.
Yes, every morning when I come to the hospital, I go to the obstetrician lounge. I don't go to my area. I go spend time with them and have my coffee. So, you like to have tea, right? In the morning, you have your tea with the obstetricians every day, and that will help. I think they need more interaction with us, right? We don't spend enough time together in our disciplines. And cord clamping research, that's the most fun part of it. We finally become more tied with our obstetrical colleagues. And I think it's something we should all do.
Yeah, perfectly. And for those who are not convinced, they can watch this recording of this lecture again. So you did talk about the oxygen saturation getting different when it comes to fetal hemoglobin going more. Do you think that the LCOR recommendation about a minute-specific oxygen saturation needs to change? Because that was the data from 2010, and and we're talking now that you are talking of a universal acceptance of a DCC.
Right. No, there's been some good cohort studies. Max Vento from Spain published new normograms with delayed cord clamping in healthy term babies. And so unfortunately, all our normograms have to come from healthy kids that don't get oxygen. And so there's been some discussion whether or not we should have better targets for those kids now that we have new data. So I agree with you. Heart rate targets might be different than the original Dawson curves that were all immediate cord clamping. But I don't know if they're going to change anytime soon. I think the focus is, if you do delay, at least your numbers will be better than the what's published out there. So you might need to provide less support, which is always a good thing.
Okay, so two another questions. One is that when you do a cord plus gas, in an asphyxiated baby, you want to find out a cord, and how do you take it if you're planning to do a delayed cord clamping in that?
Yeah, we still do it after the cord is clamped and cut. There is data demonstrating that when you wait, that there is slightly an increased base deficit and slightly lower pH in those babies in the cord blood if it sits. There is a group in Sweden that is actually taking the little tuberculosis syringes, the TB syringes, and doing it while the cord is connected and sampling right away and still doing the delay. They don't have any issues with that sterilely. I have not done that. If that's a big concern for your unit, you could either sample directly or just understand that there might be a little bit of a slightly lower pH if you do it. But we still routinely do cord gases even after delay. And there is enough blood left if that's a concern after delayed cord clamping. We have not had issues with that.
So one of the interesting question is you used to probably say when you cut the cord and you start immediately you used to cut the cord and calculate ABGA score from there. And now that you're delaying it, you take the ABGA score 0 minute and 1 minute right from the time you cut the cord or the moment the baby is born, or where do you take it?
Yeah, we still take it from the moment the baby's born. We usually assign, they usually ask us if we're in the operating room or somebody's doing something on the cord, what the 1 minute was. We all know the 1 minute is the most subjective assessment. So yes, even though you might not listen to the heart rate, if the baby's vigorous, et cetera, you can assume that the heart rate is above, 100. But So we do some assumptions at the 1 minute that we can't directly obtain by looking at the baby on the cord, but we do it from birth, not from cord cutting. And I think that's what most centers are still doing. They still look at it from when the baby's born, not after the cord is clamped, because we know by then a lot of transitions already happened on that infant if we wait till after the cord is cut.
Excellent. I think that has answered most of the questions. Manoj, can you find any other question that is still unanswered? But a lot of compliment. One of the questions that has come up is, sorry. Yeah, one of the questions
please go ahead.
Yeah, one of the questions is that, the many people in India are doing stem cell banking. So how do you convince your obstetrical colleague that the volume is not going to be insufficient, or it does intend to be a little insufficient at times?
I know, yeah, we have that come up sometimes too. I still tell them, it's still better for all these things that we're trying to prevent in the babies, giving some stem cells to the baby is still beneficial. And you can still have enough, if it's a private storage, apparently that you don't need as much blood versus public banking where you're going to donate it somewhere else. So most of the families that want to do this, it's for themselves. And so I encourage and tell the obstetricians that you can do banking after, but at least give the baby that first minute of blood before doing anything else, because it just doesn't make sense to steal that blood from the baby just to save it for later. So I've tried to work with our obstetricians that it's still helpful, and they can still have that if the families want it. But my bias is to always try to give as much to the baby as possible, at that time.
DCC in cesarean section under general anesthesia. Probably the asking is that whether can we reduce the transfer of anesthetic drugs to the child?
Right. That's always a great theoretical question. Many people talk about Virginia Apgar. The reason we did early cord clamping is because she, as an anesthesiologist, said she didn't want the anesthetics to get to the baby. So, but now I think number one, we've included moms under general in our trials to get evidence. And we have not had any babies. When we looked at the incidence of intubation or resuscitation, it's been no different between those two groups. There's obviously a lot of anxiety in those babies, but we've not seen any depression. In fact, if anything, a lot of times if babies are going to have more depression, it's from getting high levels of magnesium that we're seeing a lot before delivery, but not from general anesthesia. So we encourage it, again, for the same reason, the benefit of delayed cord clamping, avoidance of clamping early before the babies are breathing is far outweighs the risk of even a little bit of anesthetic getting in, but we've not seen any effects in our trials to date. So I would encourage you to do it as much as possible, even going to the operating room to reassure the obstetricians they can wait the full minute.
So I think you've answered most of the question about RH, and this is no longer considered a contraindication. There are almost 10 questions regarding that. The one question is that if you have a child immune hydrops already developing and with a cardiac failure, would you want to do it? Maybe you have a different take on that.
Yeah, I think you could probably find some cases where even a little bit of extra volume would really hurt the baby. Then you could argue, okay, not. I mean, most of these babies with hydrops, they're born pretty urgently and quickly, and no one's going to want to wait. Is it theoretically going to do much more to the baby that's already been done? Probably not. It's still probably better for the baby to start to breathe a little bit before you clamp the cord, for the same reason that per heart, again, thinking about that LV that has to go from the placenta as the area of resistance to now clamping the cord and that systemic pressure in the aorta, I still would think it's just better for that baby to have a little bit of time to breathe and then have their cord clamped and not, if I was going to be a purist. But if someone was so scared that any drop of blood is going to send that baby into floored cardiac failure, that would be a rare case. But I don't push. I really don't push for early. Only times I push is if that mom is at risk, that she's bleeding too much or there's too much harm to the mother. That's the times I get nervous for delayed cord clamping.
Yeah, I think that answers most of the question. And the message, Sven, is that, we need to provide that placental transfusion to most. I mean, one or exceptions here and there, you probably would, but as a general population, neonatal population, all should receive placental transfusion.
Absolutely.
Sanjay, I see a question regarding by Dr. Bashir Ahmad too about I think babies who are asphyxiated to extent that heart has failed and baby may be relatively volume overloaded. How do you manage that?
So the concern, this was actually a concern even initially with our milking trial. If you take a baby who's asphyxiated and you then milk the cord, are you going to then send that baby into failure? And so I thought that's why we wanted to do a really large, I didn't get into the details of the MINVI trial, but we wanted to look at any sort of adverse outcomes needing more CPR, death, et cetera. Everything was in favor that milking still helped those babies more than clamping early. So in that situation, again, if I could delay clamp all the asphyxiated babies, I would do it. I think delay clamping is still better than milking. But when you get into clamping early in these babies, if you have asphyxia and you have huge cytokine storms, you have a poor LV function, and then the first thing you do is clamp before that baby's breathed, how are you saving that baby and helping that baby at all? There's no benefit there. So I think that's the challenge. If you can provide some additional blood volume, again, then the stem cells and other things, is that reparative, restorative for these babies? That's the kinds of questions we're looking at with milking. It's not the fix-all, but it's certainly better, in my opinion, than clamping right away.
Hi, Professor Anup. This is Rajendra Prasad.
Hi.
I have one doubt regarding the IUGR babies, because in India we have a higher burden of intrauterine growth restriction. And these babies are already prone to polycythemia and other problems. So what is your take on delaying the cord clamping in these? Like, is there any data to support that it's safe from your study?
I didn't put up that slide because of the sake of time. So the best, well, there's a few data. One data is looking at IUGR-SGA babies in one of Judith Mercer's trials, where she showed that those babies with that received delayed cord clamping compared to immediate had less suspected NEC. So it wasn't all surgical neck or medical. Combining it all, they actually had less in those babies. And we know that the IUGR babies are at high risk for NEC, right? Because of poor blood flow. So you can argue again that in that IUGR baby, in that placenta that may not be working well, may have absent end diastolic or reversal flow, giving that baby some time to even breathe, having some sort of hemodynamic stabilization that would probably not just help their brain, but their gut and other organs, is still probably better than clamping right away. And again, the idea of, sure, they can get polycythemia, just like infants of diabetic mothers can, but it's not generally going to worsen from just getting delayed cord clamping alone, which is what I'm really saying, is that clamping early in those kids isn't going to all of a sudden remove any risk factor for polycythemia in those kids necessarily, because they're already getting that whole blood should have the same crit as that infant. So you don't get this huge rise that causes a lot of pathology. And in none of these trials that we've looked at, which have include 20 to 30% IUGR babies, have we seen any increased risks of exchange transfusions in those kids. So I think, again, the likelihood of benefit of providing placental blood, even the Turkish study I showed at the end with stem cells, showed better stem cell transfer in those IUGR babies with milking compared to early, but no adverse effects when you even did milking in those kids. So I think there's still probably a role even in those tiny kids to get that additional blood.
Okay, thank you.
Yes.
And there is one study from India also, like from the Basu group, which that randomized control trial in IUGR babies. So suggesting Professor Anup is saying that probably these are the babies who were thought to be at risk, but no longer at risk, and should give the same kind of a benefit of instant transfusion like any other term. Do you have any other question, Manoj, or we wind up for the day?
Yeah, I think that's it. So thank you so much, Sanjay. Well moderated. And I really want to thank from the bottom of all our hearts, Professor Anup. It was such a wonderful session. Now, we look forward to, as I said, we look forward to hosting you in person in future. Before I invite NNF Secretary General Dr. Surendra Birch to propose a vote of thanks, our President, Dr. Praveen Kumar, is. So you want to say anything, or shall we close the session?
No, just a kind of technical comment. First of all, obviously, congratulations for this wonderful presentation and great discussion, bringing out the nuances of this trials and all. So recently we were discussing about a potential trial which is forthcoming here, and a very pertinent point was raised, which actually I found Dr. Anup also mentioned. All these complex studies, etc., may be controversial, but the very fact that if you delay for some time, and you're also stimulating, which Dr. Anup was emphasizing again and again. So potentially we may prevent a lot of babies, that they do not need PPV ultimately. And that has a lot of public health importance, that without even having this complicated trolley, etc., if you can simply delay for a certain duration and meanwhile stimulate the baby, then many of these babies will end up not needing resuscitation. And that can be very helpful. So that was my comment on that. So thank you very much.
Yeah, no, thanks for restating that.
Thank you, sir. So now, friends, we have the next session coming up after 2 weeks. We go back to our original day, that is Thursday from next session onwards. It's on 6th April, Thursday, on a very practical topic, the science and art of extubation success in NICU by Professor Vineet Bhandari from USA. So now, may I invite all of you to continue to join and participate in these sessions. Now, may I request Dr. Surendra Singh Bish to kindly propose a vote of thanks before we close. You are muted, Surendra. You are muted.
Thanks, Manoj, and thanks, Anup. It's nice looking at you again since past 2018 when we met, when I was trying to catch a cab and you helped me out. And then again in around 2020 when I had to write something on umbilical cord, delay umbilical cord. Thank you. And it's such a wonderful, when the first name came up, and it was Anup, and I was so happy to have you as the first legend from Indian soil or Indian diaspora who is going to speak for NNF. And from the 9,000 almost now 10,000 members of NNF, on their behalf, I extend my heartfelt gratitude to you for having kind of charmed us with this kind of presentation, the colorful cartoons by Satyan, the science, the experimental science which you have shown, and the last cartoon where you have simply given it in simple words also. And as rightly said by Dr. Praveen, it has some very simple tips how to do it, just trying to stimulate and trying to distract the obstetricians with just stimulating so that they don't have the hemostat in their hand. All this is so simple. And Manoj, thank you Anu for this. Thanks Manoj, Somushri, Sanjay, all the next committee who are putting up so much effort to get these legions come to at least virtually come to Indian people, NNF people, and actually tell us how they are doing. And this will actually inspire more of us to take up these kind of projects, as Sir was rightly saying. And your trial on cord milk which is happening now, is we are looking forward to it. And anything else I need to thank Manoj. I think all of the panelists are there. Dr. Vishnu Bhatt was there, I think. And I think Sir is there. Thank you, Sir. Thanks.
Thanks, Brenda.
Thank you.
So with all your permission, we'll close this session. As I said, we'll meet again after 2 weeks. Thank you so much, everyone. Professor Anup, a special thanks to you.
Thank you again. All right.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you. Bye-bye.